We've been looking at different ways that we tend to relate to God. We've been checking out 4 different postures of relating to God that were summarized by author Skye Jethani in his book called With, Reimagining the Way You Relate to God. In this series, we're using some of the ideas and even little sketches that Skye has used in his book, so I want to give him credit for making these. This first image that we've been looking at is a graphic that reminds us that we often try to live our life based on fear and control. Our world is full of danger, and that causes us to be afraid. And so we all end up seeking different ways of trying to control our lives to avoid the things we're afraid of. But the problem is, as we seek control, we end up bringing more danger into the world. Now, last week we looked at one of the ways that many people end up relating with God, and a lot of religious people end up relating to God. That's called life under God. In all these drawings, the triangle symbolizes God. And life under God is a way of living where we think we can get God to control our circumstances for us. If we do the right things, if we are moral, if we do the right rituals, then God will bless us. And so he will take care of us. He'll control our circumstances for us. On the flip side, if we do the wrong things, if we don't do the right rituals, if we are immoral, if we sin, then God will be mad at us and he'll curse us. That way of thinking is rooted in fear of what might happen and fear of God. Now, we think we can manipulate God into pulling the strings for us, controlling our world, controlling our circumstances, and helping us avoid fear. And the problem with that is it ends up putting us in a place where we can manipulate God. God becomes a force who we can affect for our good in the world. Most of us live this way in small ways, thinking that if we sin, God is mad at us, or thinking that if things are going well, then we must have been following God well. But if you take this way of thinking to its logical extreme, we get to religious extremism. 9/11 was a huge turning point. There were religious extremists who thought they were doing the will of God and brought violence into the world. And after 2001, there was a big boost in the number of books about atheism that came out in the first decade of the 2000s. A movement called the New Atheism really got going, which was a movement where atheists would be more antagonistic towards people of faith. A lot of times, these new atheists thought that all of our problems in the world, like warfare, are rooted in religion. All these religious people are doing these things to one another, and it's creating more violence in the world. But this mindset was incredibly short-sighted. It was just based on the single event of 9/11, and then they would cherry-pick different historical precedents. It very quickly forgot about all the human tragedy of the 20th century that took place in communist nations. Now, what's relevant for this conversation isn't the preferred economic system of those communist nations, but their atheism. A lot of the 20th century communist nations were atheist, and there were officially atheist nations like the Soviet Union, China, or Cambodia that saw massive human rights violations or even genocide during the 20th century. So what we see from this is that life under God is not the only cause of massive evil in our world. Life over God can be as well. Atheism can be as well. Terrible evil is not limited to people who live life under God, but can also be carried out by those who live life over God. And the reason is that this cycle of danger, fear, and control is common to all of us. We all live in a dangerous world, and so we all end up being afraid, and we all seek control in different ways. And so because of that, all of us can end up living a life over God. Now, maybe you're like me, and you're somebody who from time to time can begin to doubt everything about God. I will sometimes doubt God's existence. Am I wasting my life not only following God, but being a pastor? This is a big question that I have from time to time. Maybe you are like me, and sometimes you have these kind of doubts. Maybe you're not. But we're talking today about a tendency that we all share to cut God out of the picture in how we live on a day-to-day basis. Whether or not you consciously doubt God's existence, all of us at times live as if we are atheists. We can believe consciously in God's existence and still end up treating God like he's just a part of the world that can be explained through cause and effect, instead of thinking of God as a person who we have a relationship with, let alone a person who is all-powerful and all-knowing. A major event in world history was the apple landing on Isaac Newton's head when he began to think about gravity. And in this moment in the 1700s, Newton gave birth to the scientific revolution, where the world began to think differently about how the world worked. We know this time in history as the Enlightenment. Before the Enlightenment, people thought of God's will as being what made the universe work. If you offended God, then things were going to go badly for you. If you pleased God, things would go well for you. And maybe God had other reasons why he would do things. There were different theological ideas. But something changed in the Enlightenment with Isaac Newton and all the other scientists and then philosophers who came after him. No longer do we need to live life under God. Now we can try to understand the laws that govern the universe, laws of science, laws of math, and other principles that guide our lives. No longer do we need to appease God to control our future, to make sure that he's happy with us. Now we can just seek to understand how the world works. Oh, God made the world, so it must make sense. We can understand it. And if we understand the right laws and principles about the world, we can control our future. A great example of this is disease, and we happen to be living in a pandemic right now. Before the Enlightenment, when somebody was sick, you would go to clergy members, you'd go to pastors or other religious leaders in your community and ask for prayer. Post-Enlightenment, we go to medicine to deal with our illness. There's a big difference there. Now, both of these things are good. We should go to one another for prayer, and we should use science to understand what's happening in our world and to figure out ways to make things better. But the problem is that neither of those are the ultimate thing you need. Right now, as we are in this pandemic, it's important for us to listen to science. What can we learn to help control our future? And it's important for us to pray and ask God to speak to us and to heal us. But these aren't the ultimate things we need. Science is good and knowledge is good. God made the world to make sense. However, that's not the be-all, end-all. Science can give us good practices, but we are still hurting inside. One of the best practices right now is to be isolated, but being isolated causes us to feel alone. And so we know that there's a deep need within us to be in communion with each other and with God. We need to experience God's presence with us. We are not designed to live life under God. We're not designed to live life over God just based on principles or laws of science. We are designed to live life with God. Living life with God can take on elements of principles and knowledge and can take on elements of wanting to please God, but it doesn't take on this foundational way of life that we find in either life under God or life over God, where we're trying to seek control on our own. Let's zoom back out to the problem of living life over God more generally. Much of the time, we live like deists, not as those who live with Jesus. Now, some of us are familiar with the phrase deism, and it might be new to some of us as well. You've probably heard of atheism. Atheism and its opposite, theism, are more well known. Theism is the belief in God. Atheism is the belief in no God. A means no. Deism is sort of like theism and sort of like atheism. In theism, the idea is that God made the world and is somehow involved in the ongoing operation of the world. He's involved in our lives day to day. Deism sees things differently. Deism thinks that God made the world, set it up with laws of science, and now leaves it alone. And a lot of really influential thinkers in Western society were deists. Thomas Jefferson was a deist. Albert Einstein was a deist. Deists often are associated with the watchmaker picture, where a watchmaker builds a watch and sets up all the gears, all the ways that the watch works, and starts it and leaves it alone. The watchmaker no longer is involved in the operation of the watch. The watch runs itself. So a lot of deists think of the universe as having been made by God with natural laws, so it makes sense, but now God has a hands-off approach to things. A conventional theist way of thinking is that God establishes all of these laws of the universe, but continues to be involved in them. God is has created the weather systems, but he is still, as it rains, he is still involved in this rain right now, as well as creating the whole system of climate and weather that we have in the world. Deism, in some ways, is similar to theism in that it believes there's a God, but in many ways it's actually similar to atheism, because both deism and atheism think that the best way to understand our present circumstances are to try to understand the natural laws that govern the universe and the principles for living a good life, and live our lives based on those things. Deism and atheism are both forms of life over God. If you remember in life under God, we had this picture where we are trying to control God to get him to control the world to help us avoid our fears. But in life over God, we can cut God out of the picture altogether. And we can just begin to control the world directly by understanding the laws and principles upon which it is built. And we believe that if we understand those laws and principles well, and we practice them well, then we can control the future. God is removed from the equation altogether. Now, life over God and life under God can come into major conflict. And many of the culture wars that we see in our society are between people who are living in the under and over camps. For example, scientific research has shown that teaching teenagers about safe sex and condom usage can reduce sexually transmitted diseases. But many religious communities believe that only abstinence should be taught because we don't want to be teaching impurity. So we have a contrast between people who are following science, building their life on principles, which we could call life over God, and we have, on the other hand, people who really are committed to purity because they don't want to make God angry. Ethical issues are a major point of conflict between these two camps. Religious people can often find their reasoning for their stance on an ethical issue in believing that something is either impure or pure, abhorrent to God or pleasing to God. On the other hand, secular people often find their stance being based on whether or not something causes harm or is safe. Cultural debates around sexuality and gender often are so divisive because the two sides are starting from such different postures. They don't speak a common language. They don't start on a common planet. Those of us who live life with Jesus should be those who have a completely different starting point altogether. We should be asking the question, what actions can I take to help others commune with God? And what actions can I take to help myself commune with God? How do I listen to others who are communing with God and seek their counsel and what I should do, rather than thinking I can figure it all out or my culture can figure it all out? This framework is totally different from either side of the culture war. As you live in this way of thinking, you may end up having the same opinion as somebody who is living life over God, or you may end up having the same opinion as someone who is living life under God. But your reason for coming to those convictions is going to be very different. Both the under and over camps are seeking happiness as an opposite of fear. Thomas Jefferson, one of the main proponents of life over God, talked about how we all have the right to the pursuit of happiness. But what the life with God posture is seeking is wholeness, shalom. Wholeness is communion with God, and it may not immediately feel happy. And it is concerned with what is good for all people, not just what is good for me. Now, what's really strange is that people who are living life under God often still end up trying to live life over God at the same time. Since all of us are alive in the modern world, we are influenced by this way of thinking very deeply, even if we are consciously aware that God is involved in our lives. We know that there is something deeper than just natural laws to explain this universe. We know that there is a God who's involved in it somehow. And we are aware that God is involved in all things, but we can also just fall into the way of thinking that life principles are all we need. We can still end up with a very cause and effect way of living. If I do this, then this will happen. We can get really interested in 5 principles for managing your money, or 6 principles for a good marriage, or 7 principles of leadership, or 8 principles of parenting. And we believe that if we just follow the right principles, then our outcome is guaranteed to go well. And if we find ourselves in trouble, then either we took a shortcut and forgot to follow our principles, or we followed the wrong principles. Many Christians approach the Bible as a book of principles. You've probably heard the phrase that Bible stands for basic instructions before leaving earth. This phrase is wrong for a number of reasons, but one of the reasons that it's wrong is it treats the Bible as an instruction manual for life, and that's not what the Bible is. The Bible is meant to be a way of spending time with God, getting to know Him better, developing a relationship. A lot of people also try to live a life based on the book of Proverbs. And one of my favorite phrases I learned in Bible college is that Proverbs are principles, not promises. Principles don't always come out the way that they're expected to. And there are books like Job and Lamentations and Ecclesiastes that are in the Bible that are all about how living a life of principles doesn't always go the way you expect. In the book of John, Jesus is speaking to the religious people, and he says, "You study the scriptures diligently because you think that in them you have eternal life. These are the very scriptures that testify about me, yet you refuse to come to me to have life." You and I aren't meant to have a relationship with an instruction book. You and I are meant to have a relationship with God. And the Bible is a way of pointing us to Jesus, who is the revelation of God, who shows us what God is like and who we have a relationship with. Many people think that being a Christian is all about getting rid of worldly principles and exchanging them for biblical principles or Christian principles, living by godly principles instead. But that's not what it means to walk with Jesus. Now, I hope that living with Jesus also involves following biblical principles, but that's not the main thing it's about. For example, it would be possible for me to hear about some financial expert and begin following the principles that that person taught. But I never have to know that person and build a relationship with them. I just am following their principles. Now, on the other hand, if I have a good friend who happens to be a financial expert, our relationship is first and foremost a relationship between two people. But as I get to know that person, of course, I'm going to ask them, "Hey, what should I do with my personal finances? You know all about this. Can you help me with this?" And of course, I would take on some of those principles. But at the core of our relationship would be our relationship with each other. Speaking of financial principles and Christians, one figure who's been in the news lately has been Dave Ramsey. Dave Ramsey is a well-known financial advisor, and he says that his principles he teaches are biblical principles, although many people who aren't Christians follow his principles as well. And Dave Ramsey's been in the news because there's been a number of news stories that have come out from people who have worked at his company who have said it's just an awful place to work and the people are not treated with respect or very kindly there. And unfortunately, some of the things that I heard about this work environment reminded me of a number of places that I've worked in my life or that I've had friends who have worked that are Christian organizations. And a lot of times, these places that are supposed to be based on biblical principles often don't feel like the love of Christ. Now, no place is perfect, so take that for what it's worth. But what we see is that if we're building ourselves on advertising ourselves as Christian or based on Christian principles, that doesn't guarantee that we're going to do things in a way that reflects the character and heart of Jesus. Instead, if we live our life with God, seeking to deepen our communion with Him, that will hopefully cause us to become people who exhibit the character of Jesus in all aspects, not just in a limited sector of our lives where we might be pointed to certain principles. Now, life over God is very appealing to us because it really gives us a feeling of control. But that control is an illusion, and it's only for our own good, not the good of others. And what happens when something unexpected happens? Someone gets sick or dies, or the financial system is altered, a natural disaster happens, or a pandemic starts. Our control is gone. Now, even deeper than that, the idea of cutting God out of the picture and controlling things directly for ourselves is exactly what the sin of Adam and Eve was all about when they took the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil for themselves, and they no longer had to depend on God in that relationship to explain that for them and to be the definer of good for them. We have this tendency to think that we need more control because we are afraid of what will happen if we don't have it. There's a really interesting story in the books of Exodus and Numbers that illustrates this concept. We see Moses, this great man, fall into this way of living life over God instead of life with God. So let's check out the first story in Exodus 17 that shows us when Moses is listening to God and has an experience with God. So Moses has led the people out of Egypt into the desert, and they're being taken to the promised land, but the people are thirsty, and this is what happens. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin, traveling from place to place as the Lord commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. So they quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses. They said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." The Lord answered Moses, "Go out in front of the people, take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." So Moses did this in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the place Massah and Meribah, because the Israelites quarreled, and because they tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Moses does what God says. He strikes the rock with his staff. And it meets the need that the people have, and God is with them in this incident. Now, quite some time later, they come to another place in the desert, and the people are grumbling again. This is the next generation of Israelites, but Moses is still their leader. And in Numbers 20, we read a similar story and how Moses responds to God here. In the first month, the whole Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh. There, Miriam died and was buried. Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, "If only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into the wilderness, that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there's no water to drink." Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meeting and fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord said to Moses, "Take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. You will bring water out of the rock for the community, so they and their livestock can drink." So it's the similar situation, and God says once again to take the staff, but this time God tells Moses to speak to the rock instead of striking it with his staff. So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he commanded him. He and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, "Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?" Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. But the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I will give them." These were the waters of Meribah, where the Israelites quarreled with the Lord, and where he was proved holy among them. So the second time this incident happens, Moses is told to speak to the rock, but he instead uses his staff to strike the rock. Now, what's he doing here? He has been in this situation before, and last time God gave him a principle. He said, "Strike the rock and water will come from it." This time, God has given him a different kind of wisdom. He says, "Speak to the rock." But Moses instead relies on his own experience, his own principle of what worked before, and he does it again. And he does it twice for good measure. And it's effective. Water does come out of the rock, but it's not faithful to what God said to do. What defines success? In life over God, success is defined by effectively mitigating our fears through our control. The people were afraid they would die of thirst, and Moses was afraid of what the people would do to him as a leader. And so from Moses' perspective of being an effective leader and mitigating his fear, he was successful. He struck the rock and water came out of it. He solved the problem. However, if we're looking at life through a life with God framework, success doesn't look like effectiveness. Success looks like living in a trusting relationship of love with God. Success looks like faithfulness to what he tells us to do, faithfulness to his calling. Moses probably would have been effective if he had listened to God. But even if he wasn't, even if he spoke to the rock like God said to do and nothing happened, he still would have been successful in God's eyes. Because to God, the bigger picture is of being united with him, trusting in him, and surrendering our control. Life over God exchanges a relationship with the creator of the universe for a measly set of principles. And those principles can turn out to be effective or not. But life over God says, I'm going to go with these principles, these ideas, instead of a relationship with the creator of all. When those principles fail, we are left carrying the ruins of our lives alone. We've taken this on for ourselves, and it's our fault that it didn't go well. And we might end up blaming ourselves, or we might end up blaming others as we lash out. We might end up blaming the principles. Oh, I chose the wrong ones, or this person didn't know what they were talking about. Or we might even blame God if we think of him as the source of principles. But on the other hand, if those principles succeed, it's still not great for us. Let's say we get some good principles for our finances or a marriage or for parenting or for your job. We can end up succeeding, being effective, and end up praising ourselves for choosing the right things and being diligent and disciplined. We may end up praising the principles for being so great and tell all of our friends and family, you got to do the same thing that I did. It works. Or we might even end up praising the Bible. Man, look at how effective and good my life has been since I started following the book of Proverbs. But we're not necessarily drawn into God's love any more deeply. If we live our life based on principles or laws of cause and effect, there is one thing that is sure to happen, one effect that we will cause. We gradually marginalize God and become self-reliant and self-sufficient, just like Adam and Eve. We end up living life without God. Most likely, if you were living a life based on principles a year ago, some of those have not gone as planned. Your life has been disrupted. I know it's painful, but one silver lining is that the curtains are pulled back and the truth is revealed. We're able to see the truth that life over God is an illusion. Our ability to control our destiny is an illusion. So take advantage of this time, of this disruption, and begin some practices that help you live life with God instead of life over God. For example, I have been spending some of my time during the pandemic learning about financial principles and investing and saving over the past few months. Now, it can be very tempting for me to begin trying to live my life based on those principles. If I do these things, then things will go well for me. I can begin living life over God in this area of my life. I can begin to think that I can control my outcome. One thing that has been really helpful for me has been the generosity prayer that we pray on Sundays. As weekly, and I'm actually recording it earlier in the week, so I'm saying it twice a week, I'm saying this thing out loud to remind myself that no matter what I do, I can't control what happens with my financial reality. Now, it's good for me to learn. It's good for me to listen to these principles and to be wise and practice them. But I also need to remember that that can't be my foundation for life. My life is built on God's presence, and I want to take advantage of the wisdom he's given to other people and me. I want to steward the resources he's given me well, but my foundation is in him. These other things are secondary. So, what about you? What parts of your life do you tend to try to live based on natural laws or principles? And what are some practices that you can develop to help yourself establish your foundation in life with God? And once you are living life with God, what role would principles and laws and science play in your life? I pray that you'll consider these things and that you won't just think about them in the abstract, but that you would invite God to be with you as you mull these over, that you invite his Spirit to guide you, to put your foundation in being with him.